discussion is the primary way of sharing ideas between souls. Through it, one can communicate thoughts and feelings to fellow man. It can be used to plan for the future, to reason about philosophical matters, and simply to relax and take delight in life. The philosopher Socrates believes that truth is the greatest virtue and that man should pursue it above all else. He theorizes that man has already been exposed to great knowledge in the land of the forms, but on his jolting ride to the physical world, he temporarily lost hold of this knowledge, yet it still exists within him. In man's struggle to recall this knowledge, Socrates believes that making use of discussion, specifically the dialectical method, is capable of lending the greatest help. Dialectics consists of contesting one's own ideas with the ideas of others through discussion to reveal truth. Thus, although a vision of the forms exists within man, Socrates asserts that sharing and reflecting on thoughts with others can help reveal the truth within him. When there is a coincidence of a beautiful disposition in the soul and corresponding and harmonious beauties of the same type in the bodily form, is not this the fairest spectacle for one who is capable of contemplation? This coincidence is the alignment of one's thoughts with the truth of the forms in one's soul. Socrates does not profess to be a wise man, so he seeks after men who supposedly hold a native wisdom. He has fascinating discussions about lofty and fundamental ideas with respectable men such as Callisthes and Glaucon. However, Socrates and his companions do not always reach a definite conclusion as a result of these often lengthy talks. To spend such a great amount of time in conversation without reaching an answer to the primary question, and often even seeing the rise of more questions in the process, may seem like a waste of time. After all, if the entire purpose for the discussion is to pursue the answer to a particular question, and if that seemingly simple goal is not reached, then would it not be a better use of time to do something other than partake in such an apparently fruitless endeavor? Is it not wiser to put one's efforts at learning into a method that is more likely to yield success? One such method of learning is the art of lecturing. Rather than leading multiple lines through a journey with uncertain results, as is the case in dialectic, a lecture teaches the reader or listener by preaching information on a given subject. Reading Aristotle's discourse on metaphysics will be a more straightforward and almost undoubtedly more conclusive activity than taking a discussion with one's friend about some lofty idea or another in a manner following Plato's famous dialogues. After all, if a discussion runs its course and the participants have not attained the truths after which they sought, then it would certainly have been more worth their while to spend a few hours studying the indicative writing of Aristotle. Nevertheless, it is worth taking a careful look at the nature of discussion to determine in what ways it can be of use, and whether it is worthy of the high esteem that some give it. Dialectic is a form of discussion that employs the faculties of logic and reason to weigh the merits of conflicting arguments with the goal of refuting any fallacies in each argument and forming a synthesis of the truth of the matter. Socrates proposes a method of dialectic whereby one begins with fundamental assumptions that are not thought of as undisputed starting points, but as hypotheses, underpinnings, footings, and springboards, so to speak, to enable it to rise to that which requires no assumption and is the starting point of all. Upon finding such a precept, one descends back to the original hypothesis, proving it without the use of the senses, but instead through a logical progression of ideas. In Proposition 6 of Book 1 of his Elements, in order to prove the equality of two lines AB and AC, Euclid assumes that if they are unequal, one must be greater. After declaring AB to be the greater, he cuts off a portion of AB supposedly equal to AC. In doing so, he creates the new triangle DBC, which should logically be equal to ACB, yet it is visually apparent that this would make the less equal to the greater, which is absurd. This prompts Euclid to retrace his steps and find that the earlier assumption that AB and AC are unequal is incorrect, and therefore that AB and AC are indeed equal. Socrates employs a similar method of reasoning in his famous dialogues with men such as Glaucon, Thrasymachus, Callisthes, and Phaedrus, whom he engages in attempts to discover truth. To challenge existing views presented by his companions, Socrates extrapolates upon their ideas to a point at which the men realize that they have reached an impossible conclusion. Due to the fact that they reason from this assumption to an irreconcilable inconsistency, he deems that the original hypothesis must have been incorrect. Euclid's geometric proofs have a sort of responsive nature. At first, the proof travels in one direction based on a hypothetical assumption, but upon arriving at an impossibility, it quickly changes course and returns home, now certain of the truth or untruth of the earlier hypothesis. Similarly, a discussion can begin with a hypothesis, and after examination, it may change direction entirely if the participants so choose. Dialectic is responsive, just as Euclid's proofs dynamically move through logic. Thus, with the power of dialectic and through careful intentional questioning, Socrates leads men by their own reasoning to realize truth through a logical contradiction as masterfully as he could through his propositions of geometry. Through dialectic, one's thoughts are constantly being checked by another mind. Sometimes, throughout the course of a vividly changing discussion, it becomes beneficial to change one's views slightly, so as to avoid a contradiction with something one said earlier. In many cases, one might not even notice, or if one does, the inconsistency is dismissed as unimportant. However, if someone says something that is apparently inconsistent with the rest of his beliefs, others may notice and provide a correction. Socrates' partners in discussion are often guilty of this. In the Gorgias, Socrates argues with Polus and Callicles over what exactly is the greatest good for mankind. Polus claims that power is the greatest good, but Socrates presents the example of a tyrant, claiming that while the tyrant has great power, he is in the worst position, because to inflict wrong is worse than to suffer it, and thus power cannot be a measure of goodness. Callicles is astonished at this conclusion and is eager to refute it. He exclaims, "Why? How could a man be happy when a slave to anybody at all? No, but the naturally noble and just is what I now describe to you with all frankness, namely that anyone who is to live aright should satisfy every appetite and will it craves." Thus, Callicles believes that the full engagement of one's passions is the highest good that man can come to, and those who lack the means to satisfy their passions delude themselves into thinking that temperance is best. Throughout his discussion with Socrates, Callicles seems to be changing his definition of what makes a man superior to another, first saying that it is strength, then wisdom, and finally courage. Socrates points out Callicles' inconsistency, and when Callicles protests, Socrates retorts, "You claim that I keep saying the same things and reproach me with it, but I make the opposite statement of you, that you never say the same things about the same subjects." Thus, Callicles dislikes the fact that Socrates says the same thing many times, while Socrates disapproves the fact that Callicles routinely shifts his opinion. The former complaint is naturally ridiculous, because saying the same thing multiple times demonstrates one's confidence that the repeated assertion is true, while changing one's stance on an issue as it becomes advantageous shows a lack of devotion to truth. Disregarding Socrates' well-intentioned criticism, Callicles proudly denies his inconsistency. Socrates proceeds to show that cowards often feel more pleasure in pain than brave men, forcing Callicles to concede that some pleasures are nobler than others. Thus, by pointing out Callicles' inconsistency and offering his insight into the matter, Socrates gradually brings Callicles to see a broader picture and realize that the pleasant and the good are indeed not the same thing. Further, Callicles comes to realize that the pleasant should be done for the sake of the good, and not the good for the sake of the pleasant. Finally, the men agree that the good does not come about through accident, but through a certain rightness and order, and through the art that is assigned to each of them. Thus, Socrates facilitates a beneficial discussion by helping Callicles and Polus to recognize their own shortcomings. The frequent shifting of opinions in the Gorgias is a single instance of a recurring theme in dialectic. Human imperfection leads to errors in word or deed, but with the assistance of another person through dialectic, one can often overcome certain inconsistencies in this character and gain a greater appreciation for truth. In the Phaedrus, Socrates compares writing to painting, observing that the works of a painter appear alive, yet they are inanimate images. In a similar way, written words seem to talk to you as though they were intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say, from a desire to be instructed, they go on telling you just the same thing forever. Thus, the problem with lecture is that it is a one-sided endeavor. The lecture itself is unable to respond to objections presented by its audience. On the other hand, the nature of a discussion is to bring together different ideas formulated by multiple minds, welcoming questions and rebuttals. Although such responsiveness is foreign to the nature of lecture, it is one of the defining features of dialectic. In a similar fashion to Socrates' dialectic, the Quaesio format that St. Thomas Aquinas uses in his Summa Theologica shows a progression of ideas brought about by arguments from opposing sides. A Quaesio follows a progression whereby a question is declared for a master and his students to debate. The students present objections to the answer that the master will give. The master first reads a scripture quote known as the sed contra that briefly sets forth the position that the master will defend. Then the master gives his answer or response to the question posed, and finally he replies to the individual objections given earlier by the students. This format is evident in the Summa Theologica. For example, in his question on whether the existence of God is self-evident, Aquinas displays 3 objections claiming that the existence of God is in fact self-evident. The objections reference Damascene, Aristotle, and the Apostle John. In short, they argue that, firstly, when something is naturally implanted in man, it is considered self-evident, and Damascene argues that the knowledge of God is inherent in man's nature. Next, the objector reminds Aquinas of Aristotle's analysis that the first principles of demonstration are self-evident because they are known simply by holding the terms in one's mind. Thus, because it is God's nature to be that than which nothing greater can be conceived, the moment one has a mental awareness of God, it naturally follows that he exists in reality. Finally, it is argued that because the existence of truth is self-evident based on the law of non-contradiction, and because God is truth, then God must be self-evident. In response, Aquinas brings forth Psalm 14:1, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God," to suggest that he will defend the position that the existence of God is not self-evident. Next, he explains that some things are self-evident of themselves, yet not to others, and other things are self-evident both of themselves and also to others. He asserts that God's self-evidence is of the former kind, and thus is not self-evident to man. However, if he were only to provide this answer, the discussion would be on a level playing field because worthy arguments have been submitted on both sides. Thus, he concludes by responding to each objection, often building on his main answer, showing why each objection is invalid. Due to the style that Aquinas uses, reading the Summa Theologica is strikingly similar to watching a theological debate. It has a more rigid format than Plato's dialogues, but it still presents a progression of ideas arising from arguments created specifically in response to those from the opposing side. Perhaps Aquinas follows this style of writing to encourage the reader to learn this method of carefully examining ideas and applying it in his own life so that he may approach truth more critically and thoroughly. It is apparent that dialectic can be a powerful tool in discussion, but how exactly does it change those who take part in it? Participating in a lofty-minded discussion requires one not only to think critically about one's own view on the matter, but also to be willing to present that view to others for their consideration and critique. It is not fun for one's idea, which had been given careful consideration and nurturing, to be shot down in a not-so-glorious flame. This may seem overly dramatic, but it is surprising how real the theoretical world of ideas can be to those who pursue it. Therefore, it is crucial to learn to accept the possibility that one may not be as well versed in others as others in some issues, and one may even be flat out wrong. After all, pathematos, or there is learning in suffering and experience. It is imperative that one cultivate the virtue of courage in order to appreciate the critique offered to him. As with other virtues, there is no better way to do so than through experience. The rewards are well worth the challenge. A world of infinite possibilities is opened up when one allows himself to learn from others. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. One does not necessarily have to be older or wiser to teach another, but all that is necessary is for one to allow himself to learn from others, rather than always stubbornly believing his own ideas and dismissing any possibility for change. Some consider all types of change to be evil, but allowing one's soul to be changed for the better is one of the greatest goods achievable by man. Learning to distinguish between good and bad change is the aim of the philosopher. In addition, Socrates argues that it is not enough merely to be acquainted with rhetorical devices to be a rhetorician, just as it is not enough simply to read books on medicine to become a physician. One must know not only the parts, but how to put the parts together. Further, the dialectician must have the skill to bring a dispersed plurality under a single form, seeing it all together, and to divide it into forms, not to attempt to hack off parts like a clumsy butcher. In Kantian terminology, the dialectician must be able to synthesize and analyze, that is, to collect things together into a comprehensive whole, and break them down into distinctive parts. Thus, dialectic pushes one to dissect and categorize his thoughts, as well as formulate and defend his own opinions on important issues while striving to learn from others. While Plato's dialogues and Aquinas' writings display a noble form of conversation in dialectic, other types of conversation are not as high-minded. Here, an important distinction must be drawn between dialectic and mere conversation. Dialectic has a specific goal, that is, to discover truth through debating another's position in a topic of interest. In contrast, much of the conversation in Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace is often done just for show. Spectacular parties are full of pointless small talk and flattery. Conversation is often self-centered and has no other goal than boosting one's own self-confidence. Berg's conversation always related entirely to himself. He would remain calm and silent when the talk related to any topic that had no direct bearing on himself. The conversations of the elites in War and Peace give a reflection of their sensualist nature. Socrates uses discussion to facilitate the discovery of truth, but pompous lords and ladies in Tolstoy use to spread lies and empty thoughts. Socrates and the lords and ladies in Tolstoy have apparently different goals in their conversations. Although this sort of conversation, common in War and Peace, is useless, sometimes conversation can even be outright dangerous. For instance, in Paradise Lost, Satan encourages the fall of mankind by tempting Eve to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge through flattery. While in the form of a serpent, he praises her, "Wonder not, sovereign mistress, if perhaps thou canst, who art soul wounded, much less arm thy looks the heaven of mildness with disdain, who shouldst be seen a goddess among gods, adored and served by angels numberless, thy daily train." Eve is astonished at the serpent's ability to speak, and questions him as to how he came to possess this power. Eve is disheartened when Satan leads her straight to the tree of which she and Adam were forbidden to eat. Satan pretends to be surprised and ignorant of the curse of the tree, and further tempts Eve, "Me, who have touched and tasted, yet both lived, and life more perfect have attained than fate meant me." Milton presents this discussion as a factor leading to man's first sin. If discussion can result in such an atrocity as the fall of mankind, should it not be shunned? As Descartes warns, the greatest souls are capable of the greatest vices, as well as the greatest virtues. In a similar way, when one person in a discussion does not have the other's best interests at heart, or is perhaps even actively trying to hurt the other, as shown in Paradise Lost, discussion can have a harmful effect. Thus, while noble conversation seeks to bring people to a greater understanding of truth, conversation backed by evil motives can have an adverse effect on the unprepared soul. Discussion is useful for teaching, but considering the potential evils of discussion, perhaps a different method would be preferable. Socrates and his companions spend a considerable amount of time, too much perhaps, arguing over what trait in particular makes a man better than others. In a lecture, on the other hand, one will find succinctness and clarity on any subject. For instance, in Aristotle's De Anima, one can find an extensive list of the faculties of the soul, as well as a discourse on each faculty and how one should understand each to contribute to the unity of the soul. Some kinds of living things, as we have said, possess the capacity for pleasure and pain, the sense for food, what is dry, moist, hot, cold, sounds, colors, and odors, and so on. De Anima is essentially a listing of the attributes of the soul. In this style of writing, there is no place for confusion and playing with words, as is abundant in Plato's dialogues. Why should one fumble around dialectic when lecture obviously affords a seemingly equal, if not greater, potential for learning? Firstly, in dialectic, each person involved in the discussion is personally challenged to present his ideas in speech. It challenges one not only to think critically about his own position on an issue, but also to voice his opinions in the actual presence of others. When studying a lecture, one does still have the ability to use discernment to determine the worth of the lecture, but the nature of the lecture is still fundamentally a one-sided ordeal. Dialectic, on the other hand, requires and encourages intellectual input from multiple people. As mentioned earlier, having two or more minds engaging in an attempt to reveal truth can be more useful than solitary thought because each can correct the other and provide insights of which the other may not be aware. Socrates describes his peculiar skill as a sort of midwife of the soul. That is, he helps bring his companions' ideas to maturity. Although the dialogues do not always end with a definite conclusion, Socrates asserts that such a discussion is not useless, for afterwards one comes to have the good sense not to fancy you know what you do not know. For that and no more is all that my art can effect. Thus, a final benefit of dialectic is apparent. Whereas a lecture certainly is capable of showing wondrous truths that originated in another's mind, dialectic reveals that there are many truths one has yet to grasp. In conclusion, discussion is a gift that is useful for expressing one's ideas to others. It can be used to achieve great good, namely discovering truth and helping others to do the same. By reflecting one's own ideas on another's soul, one can discover his own faults and gain a greater understanding of the truth. To help others grow, the philosopher Socrates employs the dialectical method, which has no other end than the revelation of truth. However, Socrates' efforts do not always yield answers to the fundamental questions that the men set forth. In addition, while dialectic is a noble pursuit, discussion can be misused, producing evil results. Taking into account these seeming faults of discussion, one may look for a better alternative to learning in the art of lecture. Lecture affords a more straightforward and definite path to knowledge. Yet, dialectic offers something special in the sense of coming to truth by one's own reasoning through a real discussion with another person. and it helps one get a better idea of that which he does not know. The responsive nature of discussion affords a more active mode of pursuing truth compared to the passivity of absorbing a lecture. Dialectic requires the engagement of one's mind and soul to formulate ideas about difficult questions, consider the opinions of others, and reconcile the two to come to a greater understanding of truth. Dialectic is the art of the eternally curious, the philosopher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dugmore. I would I'd like to begin by just noting the conundrum of education that your paper very well brings out, and that is the relationship of discussion and lecture within the classroom. My own experience, I had a bit of an educational whiplash when, after going from St. John's, where professors never lectured in class. They began with a question, and it was considered to be an atrocity if a tutor would talk too long in the classroom. It's all done on the basis of student discussion, and I had many classes where it did seem like the accumulated expression of the thoughts of many fools who did not understand at all the text that they were reading and really didn't know what it was saying, and I went away very confused. And then after that, I went to seminary, where it was all lecture, and they had the Westminster Confession of Faith, and they knew that that was the best expression of Christian theology, and their job was to make sure you understood the Westminster Confession of Faith, and they would lecture to you until you made sure you could give all the right answers on the test. Well, I myself then went into the classroom, and much more aligning myself with the St. John's model, wanted to give classes on the basis of discussion, and quickly found out with high schoolers, particularly young ones, that the very best way to get a very good discussion that they would thank you very much for at the end of class was to allow the discussion to get onto some topic that required no knowledge of the text and was usually the popular topics that were debated in the youth group. And after realizing this was not really a worthy goal for my life's vocation, came to understand that getting kids to engage questions in these particular texts was hard, and that there was a certain amount of knowledge that they needed to have. And so I started talking more in class, and realized that there was a necessity of that. Slowly you find that students were able to engage the text, and have always felt very uncomfortable trying to work out this balance of knowing how much to let people go off on their own discussions and how much to kind of hold their nose in the text by reading text and expounding particular sections of text that are central. So I would like you to answer all this conundrum by describing for me what you see as the ideal classroom experience.
Well, students should be allowed to make mistakes. They should be allowed to experiment with thought, and they should be allowed to, within the subject of the text, of course, try to reason on their own. But they should still be given guidance at first, at least, so that they have some understanding of the topic, and so that they can formulate ideas to some extent. But it is important that they're not restrained so much as to stay within those strict guidelines that you might expect from a lecture, because we learn through making mistakes. And it's a good exercise for the mind to reason beyond what you're taught in the lecture.
What would be the characteristics of a class where you went away saying, I want to read this text more thoroughly. I want to learn from this author. Because of this class experience, I'm not going away thinking, wow, I'm so intelligent, or wow, Mr. Hendricks is so intelligent because he talks so much. And I have to, my mother did sit through GBT for 5 years, and quite often she said, Fritz, it's really nice just when you talk. And my mother's desires, I had to say, this is not the benefit of my students. You know, I did not get very much in seminary where I just sat and listened to my lecturers talk. But what sort of class makes you go away saying, you know, next week I want to just pound that reading. You know, I'm really going to get into reading this author, and I want to be ready to discuss this text really to the best of my ability.
When I'm left with questions, when I don't understand the reading, that's when I want to put more effort into understanding it.
Thank you very much. Other questions?
So you kind of touched on the distinction between discussion, which seems to be a very academic thing. You're discussing ideas of kind of wrestling with truth, and conversation. And the context that you put that in was War and Peace, with all of the gossipy society lords and ladies who really are just in it to boost their own ego. Is there a little more to the distinction than that? Is conversation, maybe it's not always academic, but is it always that frivolous, I guess?
Well, no. So I say conversation is the more broad spectrum of just communicating with another person. Dialectic is when you're actively pursuing truth, when you want to take two ideas and reconcile them and produce some results, some beneficial results, and come to a greater understanding of truth. So no, discussion, dialectic is a subset of discussion. That's how I see it. So no, discussion can be much greater than what we see in War and Peace. Yeah.
First of all, I really enjoyed your paper. I was wondering about just, is there a way in which dialectic is sort of the proud man's way to become educated? Because I can't trust what other people are saying. I couldn't trust just a lecture. I need to figure out on my own. I need to come to this wisdom myself instead of trusting that somebody else has gone before me, who has read the text and can understand it more clearly. And I can. Is maybe dialectic a harder way to go about something that just sort of boosts my ego because I got to it by myself instead of just somebody else giving me the answer? So what you thought about that?
Yeah, where dialectic is the path of the skeptic. I don't want to trust what people have written. Yeah, it can be to an extent. I think it's more useful. I think dialectic is more useful when you're approaching it as a more strenuous activity than simply reading a lecture. And because of that, it can be more rewarding. Because, like you said, you reason, on your own reason, you come to some appreciation for truth. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Aaron?
Yes, at the beginning of your paper you said discussion is the... Here, I wrote it down in my notes. Let me get this real quickly. Sorry. Okay. You said discussion is the greatest way for souls to communicate. But, you know, I would believe that, you know, the greatest connection between two souls would be worshiping, worshiping with God. And, you know, while that is not necessarily a, you know, verbal discussion, how important does discussion become when you just have a direct soul-to-soul connection instead of actually speaking to each other? Like using the example of like worshiping.
Is this the very first sentence?
Yeah.
Well, the sentence is discussion is the primary way of sharing ideas. And so in this instance, I'm kind of excluding the more of a spiritual experience, and rather just the extent that we can have fellowship with each other. Yeah, I'd say that worshiping is the greatest good that we can achieve. But as far as relates sharing ideas, they might not be able to reconcile each other's opinions. And so I'd say maybe the really deep dialectic discussion that you should be reserved for the dating section when you're trying to determine the other person's beliefs. You shouldn't wait until marriage.
All right. And one more difficult question for the field of education is, Socrates at this one place, and I forget where it is, but he says, I only talk to one person at a time. And in the dialogue, you see mostly this is the case. And I mean, certainly there'll be a group of people, but when he engages them, he engages them one-on-one and shifts on to the next one. You don't have group share time. And also, you try to run a classroom and you try to give everybody opportunity to get into the conversation. Once again, this dialectic, is the classroom and real dialectic, where you get into just two people just kind of going at each other, really delving and testing ideas with one another, is dialectic also not really compatible with the classroom?
Well, I think in our GBT class, occasionally we have two outspoken people who do have a good discussion in the midst of everything. And so being able to break up a class into specific segments where I have an idea I want to advocate it, another person has a different idea they want to defend it, and they can go at it with an audience and with guidance from the teacher. So no, I think dialectic is appropriate for the classroom.
Thank you. Other questions?
Right.
Going off of what you just said for having a conversation or a dialectic in the classroom or in any situation, there are oftentimes conclusions that are reached through dialectic or no conclusions that are really beautiful and true and right and good. But then sometimes we tend to, even in GBT classrooms, stray off the path a little bit, go on a bit of a Homeric ramble and end up with conclusions that none of us really believe. And then sometimes we'll end up with a conclusion or more questions that are leading us in a direction that may not be right. Are there or should there be guidelines for a dialectic to guide the conversation in a specific direction? Is there an extent to dialectics, range of seeking wisdom? Should there be guidelines?
Well, in the Platonic dialogues, oftentimes Socrates and his companions will start with one idea and they'll move on to something completely different. Like in the Republic when they were discussing the fair, the events, and then suddenly they get into all these other topics. So I think as long as you're pursuing truth and as long as everyone participating wants to be talking about that subject, I don't see any need to restrict a discussion to one subject if that's what you're going for. Okay.
Is it worth pursuing truth through discussion between two people if there's a possibility of conflict arising? So, is compromising the peace or the relationship between two people, is the pursuit of truth more worth it than that?
That's a good question. I don't know, I think it can be. That's what Socrates thinks. He holds truth as the greatest virtue. So he would pursue that above others. But as a Christian, we're called to be loving, primarily. and seek after God. So the two, it's important to try to help the two go hand in hand. You know, discussions can be polite, and it's important for both participants to understand that and to make the best of their abilities to stay friendly.
Right, thank you. So in order for dialectic sort of like education method to work, you need like a foundation for a good discussion, right? But that foundation can best be taught really through a lecture. It can't solely be taught through dialectic. So in a way, wouldn't you say that a lecture-based education actually teaches more and appeals more to the ignorant in that subject? And is therefore, if the goal of education is to teach information, then is therefore the better education?
Yes, so I'd say going after pure knowledge, a lecture is perfect. But I'm kind of thinking about Nathan's paper, the distinction between knowledge and wisdom. And I think one component of wisdom is being able to discern between ideas and to come to a state where you can evaluate different ideas and make decisions. I think comes about best through experience, through practicing dialectic.
So would you say, where would the foundation come from then in dialectic for the discussion to happen?
Well, there needs to be some prior knowledge, and lecture is good for that. So lecture can be a good foundation, but having discussions on top of that, like we do in class, that's ideal. Olivia?
Very nice paper, I liked it. A lot of us have probably heard the saying, small minds talk about people, mediocre minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas. How much would you assert the verity of that? Would you say that great minds, as we would instinctively strive to be, only talk about ideas? Because, I mean, think about GPT, we start talking about a lot of stories, and those aren't necessarily straight up raw ideas that we get to later, but still it's a complete process on the journey towards being able to talk about what we come to in GPT-5 and moving on. So how much is it only talking about ideas, or would you say it's more of a balance between the three even?
Well, there needs to be a balance in the sense that the great mind is able to think about ideas and apply it to reality. So bridging the gap between ideas and reality, and as you mentioned, stories, we can extract ideas that are presented through stories. But I think the greatest thing is being able to take the theory and apply it to reality.
Okay, so you gave kind of the thesis of the idea that discussion reveals truth because you have multiple people giving opinions and ideas, right? But I think of some of the greatest philosophers, some of the most prominent, like Descartes. When Descartes made his philosophy, he isolated himself in a cabin somewhere and just thought, So is it possible for truth to be arrived at? And I do believe that many of the arguments Descartes made are true. Do you believe it's possible to reach truth through a means other than dialectic?
Of course. So dialectic is just using human reason, but you're with another person, and they can provide insights. They can show you where you're wrong. So I think dialectic can be more effective because two minds are greater than one. You can have ideas from multiple minds. But yeah, I think you can still arrive at truth through personal reasoning and reflection. Michael?
It seems in some subjects that lecture is really helpful, like in math, especially when you get to higher levels. If the students just had a discussion, we would never be able to figure out the problem. But the teacher can give us some rules to go by, and then we can use those rules to figure out the answer. But then in other cases, like in GBT, it seems the discussion is very helpful. So would you agree that in some cases it is better to have more lecture, or do you think all classrooms should be primarily based on dialectic?
I think there are cases where lecture is more appropriate and other cases where dialectic is appropriate. And in GBT, I think there's a nice balance actually between lecture and dialectic. In a case like math, yeah, lecture is the way to go because you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel and come up with all these mathematical formulas yourself. It's good to benefit from the work of others. And we can still do that in reasoning and ideas in straight books, but also exercising our minds through dialectic is important.
I was wondering, going kind of off that question, you know, we say with math or science that there's a very, you know, a very clear-cut, true answer. So that's why we don't want to reinvent the wheel and want to have someone lecture that to us. If, as Christians, we believe that truth is, that God is truth, and that truth is something that we can actually find and come across. It's not some abstract thing that, you know, is different to each person. We believe in an absolute truth. Then is it sort of like science that someone should lecture us and say, okay, this is right and this is wrong, instead of dialectic, because it is to us very clear-cut what truth is. So wondering, are those different aspects and different issues that people disagree on, but as we know what people would be, is truth sort of like science, or we just have a clear-cut answers and it tells us?
Well, we can't arrive at God on our own reasoning. He must reveal himself to us. And like I showed with the Euclid example, Euclid kind of reasons through, he kind of talks through it. Maybe he's talking to himself, but he's able to respond to mistakes that he makes, false assumptions that lead to good conclusions. Can you kind of rephrase the question?
Yeah, I guess it would just be the fact that if God is true and the truths that He teaches us are as true as 2 + 2 equaling 4, then should we have someone teach it to us like that? Like, you know, love your neighbor, like 2 + 2 = 4, not let's discuss loving your neighbor, let's discuss light of the mind, etc., etc. Should it be?
Yeah, so those truths that we see in the Bible, those are undisputed, of course. But based on that, we reason to higher level laws like, no noise at night, which perhaps could be found in the Ten Commandments, or maybe not. But losing it.
No, I was just wondering about the use of dialectic. Is it more important for us to get a clear-cut answer on things that we find are clear-cut instead of discussing them, like you're saying?
On answers that we know about through the Bible. We shouldn't try to reason to them. It's like trying to reason to a common notion. But we should use those as starting points. Next.
What's the title of your paper in English?
Dialectic, the finest path of conversing. Yes, sir.
Now, I'd like to go kind of play devil's advocate, I suppose. we have all these great books that we will use as kind of jumping off points for discussion. Socrates makes an argument, we say, okay, well, let's talk about that. And sometimes through those conversations you come to agree more with Socrates, sometimes not. Other times formulate your own opinions. Is there any time in biblical education where we should treat the Bible that way? Radical instance, Jesus Christ rose from the dead. Now let's talk about that. Let's discuss that. If dialectic can be effective in education, might my seminary professors actually have perhaps not used an effective tool in the arsenal of education? And that's dialectic. One other thing. My seminary professor did lecture a lot, but they did ask questions. And I was kind of the only one in class that would ask challenging questions. And it was very interesting how often other students found this very irritating. Rolling the eyes, oops, Fritz again. And I have to admit, I kind of thought in that theological education, some challenging questions might have actually been helpful to the overall enterprise. And so, even in theological education, is dialectic perhaps a necessary tool of education?
I think it can be. I think not so much in how history was written back then, but in how it applies to us today. That's where I start off by going. Like I said, we shouldn't dispute whether or not Christ rose, because the Bible clearly tells us that he did, and the Bible is God's word. That is the greatest truth that we can have right in front of us. But we can use these truths to spark interesting discussions, maybe.
All right. And did Jesus ever teach by asking questions?
Yes, he did.
Okay, other questions?
Right.
I'm so sorry, but I'm going to keep playing devil's advocate. Would you say that going about a question such as keeping the Sabbath holy, which is blatantly written in the Ten Commandments, if you were to sit down and have a discussion with a fellow Christian about what it meant to keep the Sabbath day holy, whether we should follow the rule to keep the Sabbath day holy, would that be blasphemous to the Bible and the principles that it lays out, or is that something that you just don't recommend because it's already blatantly stated, or how would you approach that?
I think it's important to discuss how the law applies. You shouldn't discuss whether or not you should follow it, but really what it means and what the Christian today should take that to mean.
What do you think of Thomas Aquinas' use of what's called the scholastic method? He will take a theological position and then give 5 positions against it. How effective do you think that is in theological education?
Well, I think it's about as close as a book can come to a real discussion without literally being a discussion, because it's still set in stone what was written. You don't read it a few times and say, oh, maybe it'll be different this time, like you might expect from a discussion. But it's useful because it is similar to the dialectical method. But I don't think it can be the same thing as literally having a discussion with someone. But effectiveness, I think lecture is more effective in theology than in other fields.
I remember an interesting conversation I had with one of my Jewish teachers at St. John's. She asked me, I was talking, she was asking about what my beliefs were, and I said, I'm a conservative Christian, and I believe the Bible is the Word of God. She asked this question, she said, do you read the Bible differently from the way you read any other book in this program? And I said, well, yes. The Bible to me is a book of authority, and I read it and receive it with that authority as being the Word of God. And she said, I read the Bible just the way I do any other book. And I was kind of, I thought often about that comment. Is there a special sort of, Bible mode that we have for when we read the Bible? That it's different in how we read it and we receive it. Or does understanding the Bible require a lot of tug and push and pull and dialectic? What does it mean to observe the Sabbath day? Are we still supposed to observe the Sabbath day? What is our relationship to the law? And how much is reading the Bible going to bring us into kind of reading experiences that are very similar just to the way we read any other book?
Can you give the question again?
Yes. Are there ways in which reading the Bible is not so dissimilar to the way we read other books? Or is the way we read the Bible a completely different experience from the way we read other books? And are there ways in which the Bible is fundamentally a different way of reading a book than the way that we read other books?
Well, it's not a completely different way of reading, I'd say. It depends on how you read normal books. If you go into them expecting to find things that will disagree in the book, then it is different, because you don't simply dispute the Ten Commandments, you don't dispute Christ's works. So there are some similarities, there are some dissimilarities, but the Bible is a holy book, and so it should be treated differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking how sometimes people will receive particular books from particular authors with a sort of almost reverence. Bon Jovi writes his book, and you buy that, and you're just going to. Some people will read that book with a sort of awe and reverence or Billy Joel. This person has this sort of, you read it with a sort of non-critical air, and. Is that similar to the way we read the Bible?
Yeah, and I think you can read a book like the Bible not looking to dispute it, but still have good conversations about it. I think with a lot of books we try to find things that we disagree about so that we can have discussions about that. But in the Bible it's different. Although we can still reason about it, we can still talk about it, discuss how it affects us. We shouldn't be looking for things that we disagree with.
Thank you very much. We are done for now. We're going to start again at 1 o'clock, and thank you all very much for our presenters this morning. You are now done. So you guys are on to more lighter things. I will start again at 1 o'clock, and I'm sorry. Come on, sorry. Yes, all right. So we'll come back at 1 o'clock. If you have a question for me, just ask that quickly. If I'm going to go here for an hour. I'm going to be out, so I have 4 more hours to go. So, if anything you need to ask me quickly, you have water over there if you need that. Otherwise, I'll see you back at 1 o'clock.